Wait a minute on satellite visual.
Possible high-value target.
Hi, I'm Keith Masback.
Keith is a former director of intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance integration for the U.S. Army.
Today we'll be breaking down clips about satellites from TV and film. Working in tandem, enemy of the state.
Okay, satellite imagery coming through.
Roger that, patch visual my location.
Give me real-time imagery coverage at lat 3855, long 7700.
First of all, I do mapping and geospatial stuff for a living. The fact that this guy knows the latitude and longitude of where he is, apparently at any place on the Earth, is pretty impressive.
Roger that, I'll need a minute on satellite visual, over.
Jack Black apparently has access to satellites 300 miles up going 17,500 miles an hour. They're not waiting around for Jack Black to tell them what to do.
Everybody move, he just jumped to the adjacent building.
A satellite's good for a lot of things. It's just not responsive in a way that you'd use for a foot chase.
Air 1, be advised, suspect heading towards front Columbia. DK, front of building on Columbia. Copy that.
Another thing that's remarkable here is the magnitude of this operation. They appear to have pulled in NSA, NGA, NRO, FBI, and the local police. And I'll tell you, short of going after someone at the level of Osama bin Laden, you're just not going to see an operation of this magnitude.
We were there for technical support.
Satellite communications, battleship.
Every 24 hours, our station in Hawaii will transmit a signal to Landsat 7, our deep-orbiting satellite.
So I'm amused in this scene by the mention of Landsat. I actually personally sit on the Landsat advisory group. So Landsat, while a fantastic series of satellites over time, has nothing to do with anything in this scene because it's an Earth imaging spacecraft. It has nothing to do with communications with other galaxies.
Our station in Hawaii will transmit a signal.
They're talking about referencing a facility in Hawaii that does deep space tracking. Those are radio telescopes that are there receiving signals from outer space generally, much less than transmitting them.
Please prepare to bear witness to the making of history.
I think when you put it all together, there's just like a mishmash of stuff going on in this scene. And they're sort of all just jumbling it all together in a way that really doesn't make sense.
It's a joke, right?
LiDAR, Bad Boys 2.
This is Tappy's compound.
Oh, CIA hooked us up, huh?
Yeah, this LiDAR laser technology even shows its escape tunnel.
So LiDAR stands for light detection and ranging, which is the use of an active sensor shooting out light photons, and what it creates is a 3D depiction that we call a point cloud. For instance, if you're able to get LiDAR into a window, those photons bounce around and kind of paint the room, so you can understand the size of the room and what things are in a room. All super helpful as you plan an operation.
We are severely screwed if we don't blow up this security room before we make a move.
So in this particular clip, you can see that they've used LiDAR perhaps from the top of the building across the street, and they've got a great depiction of the house.
This is Tappy's compound.
Intelligence is at its best when it's combining multiple sources. So here you've got the infrared, the contour mapping, and the LiDAR. When you bring it all together, it really tells a cohesive picture.
We got everything that we need to take this dude.
Getting it wrong, arrested development.
We got something, and you're gonna do time for it.
Those are the pictures?
They're all over the news.
Those are balls.
I mean, this scene is certainly an example of absolutely getting it wrong. And at the end of the day, analysts are human, and analysts do make mistakes.
Tobias had inadvertently photographed himself while learning to use his camera phone.
See, this close, they always look like landscape.
Context, of course, is critically important. Generally, you'd start from a very wide shot, and then you'd zoom in to a specific area that you're looking for something. So you have that context to begin with.
Are you serious?
Almost always.
The weight of a decision. Homeland.
All the habitations within 75 meters of the target.
Well, obviously anybody inside the farmhouse would be collateral damage.
In this scene, we see Carrie, a CIA officer, working to assess collateral damage.
I'd feel a lot better if we weren't so blind on such a short clock.
One of the things that I think is interesting is her fervent desire for just a little more time or a little more information. In the intelligence business, we sometimes refer to this as analysis paralysis. We always want a little more information. We always want one more picture. But at the end of the day, the perfect intelligence delivered 1 minute too late is absolutely worthless.
We got lucky, jacked into a NATO satellite.
And that's the location right there?
So there's a couple problems here. I think he refers to NATO satellites.
Jacked into a NATO satellite.
While NATO member nations have imaging satellites, NATO itself doesn't actually control any satellites. Another problem here, I can immediately tell that that's not a satellite image, that's a drone image. And you can tell because the system is loitering and satellites don't loiter.
Where are the F-15s?
They're buzzing the border. They can be on the target in 60 seconds.
One thing we see across many of these movies and TV shows is a lot of similar-looking operation centers or ground stations.
We were able to track the
Holding in mid-altitude orbit.
Right where we can't touch it.
Possible high-value target?
No idea what they're doing.
So actually, I've had a long-standing personal theory that we build our operation centers, we build our ground stations to look like the movies. We look at those and we think, wow, that's what it should look like, and then we replicate it ourselves. Denial and deception, billions.
All the big funds are using satellite images. How many cars are in the parking lot of Walmart indicates how big a quarter they're going to have.
I mean, that's just really interesting because that's happening. I don't think that people necessarily realize that there are commercial remote sensing firms with satellites and that companies on Wall Street and hedge funds are taking advantage of those types of images to make decisions about trades.
In January 2016, Krakow's tone on China changed, more bullish, omniscient.
The analyst says, something's changed in the tone of this person's public statements. Let me see if what they're saying matches what I can see from satellite images.
They knew they were being watched, so the truck started moving. A show for the satellites. Factories are fake. It's a show to milk investors.
Denial and deception is both an art and a science. From the time that we could see from above, people on the ground knew that they had kind of two choices. They could either hide, deny, or they could attempt to deceive, make something look different than it really is. And that continues to this day.
This is going to be fun.
High stakes mission, Zero Dark 30.
Just crossed the border, now entering Pakistan.
The long-term hunt for Osama bin Laden was one of the most significant things I've ever been involved in. So what you're seeing here is an underlying base map, foundation data, that's probably being fed by signals intelligence data, beacons from the aircraft themselves. So you're able to track them.
Prince 5-1 is down, Prince 5-1 is down.
This hunt over time for Osama bin Laden was always a very high priority for the intelligence community and the Defense Department. Thousands of satellite images were taken over time when tips indicated that we might have a bead on where he was located. As the community watched this facility, some things started to stand out. It was a very, very secure compound. It had 12-foot walls on one side. There was someone who was affectionately known as the Pacer. It was someone who came out into the walled garden and re-enter the facility. There was a suspicion among the analysts who were working this day in and day out that in fact that was Osama bin Laden. It might surprise people to know that there was not indeed certainty that we had in fact killed Osama bin Laden until there were pictures and ultimately they confirmed it with DNA testing. Satellite disruption, Independence Day.
Let's say that you wanted to coordinate with spaceships on different sides of the Earth. You couldn't send a direct signal, right?
You're talking about line of sight.
So line of sight in radio communications absolutely is a thing.
You'd need satellites to relay that signal in order to reach each ship.
Most often what satellite operators do is have their satellites talk to multiple ground stations around the Earth.
Well, I found a signal hidden inside our own satellite system.
There are certainly reasons that information from satellites gets disrupted. It could be hardware or software or firmware on the satellite itself, and even solar weather, space weather.
They're using our own satellites against us.
Infrared imagery behind enemy lines.
I think the pilot transmission came from here.
So we should stop it. Like that satellite looked like something like you'd make out of a Lego set.
Now this is imagery from a Northrop Grumman relay satellite downlinked through the Janop Processing Center in Stuttgart. We've hot-wired it for heat image.
The next thing that happens is that they somehow have hot-wired a satellite that doesn't even belong to them to use it for something it wasn't even built to do.
This isn't strictly legal, sir.
They would have lots of assets available for a search and rescue operation. That's very high priority.
That's Burnett?
Yes, sir.
Infrared imagery is quite valuable at night. You can see things that are emitting heat. You can see a vehicle which has recently been used because you're going to be able to see that the engine is still hot. You wouldn't necessarily use a satellite to look for somebody. A satellite being 300 miles away is kind of tough to get the heat signature of a single human being.
What's going on? He's down.
You've been shot?
So there's some confusion in the command center here.
Why isn't he moving?
When we see behavior that doesn't add up, that doesn't make sense, those are indicators to us that we've got to use a different approach to get more information, to explain what's going on.
You're right on him.
This is a great example of where you'd want to use everything at your disposal. You'd be using electro-optical, you'd be using infrared, you'd be using synthetic aperture radar, anything you could to pull things together to give yourself a better picture.
I want intel on this situation.
Recognizing a nuclear site, the West Wing.
This picture was taken by an SR-71 during a routine flyover in the Gulf.
The chairman of the Joint Chiefs refers to the SR-71 as taking part in a routine flyover of the Gulf. And yes, we are interested in many areas of the world, and we are looking at many areas routinely.
This is Bushehr, and this is what looks to me like the early days of construction on a light water reactor.
The location, Bushehr, actually is a site in Iran, so that's interesting.
Light water is what's used for nuclear reactors, and the Iranians have contracted the Russians to build them a light water reactor for that purpose.
Something that looks like the development of a nuclear facility is certainly going to get our attention. I'd compare it to what you do with your physician. The earlier you catch something, the more options your doctors have to take care of it. It's the same in intelligence. The sooner I can show a decision maker that something's happening, the more certainty I can give them about it. Taking a look at the image specifically, it refers to the latitude and longitude as two numbers. They'd probably be better off with that guy in the alley in the Will Smith movie.
3855.
Retasking the satellites, Patriot games.
Unless you authorize us to retask those satellites so we can get a look before they're overhead from the side, we are never going to know which camp they're at.
There's always more requests for satellite imagery from our spy satellites than we're able to meet. So we make a plan to be the most efficient collection that we can put together.
Do you have any idea how big a deal it is to retask those satellites? Yeah.
Occasionally, high priority things disrupt that plan. And so we retask those satellites to get that thing we need that is a higher priority than what we were planning to do. So it's not trivial, but it's normal.
Keep at it then.
Mismatched Expectations, Archer.
You want me to look for what? A station wagon! Clean the impending massive heart attack out of your ears!
In this scene, we see a really interesting tension between someone who is responsible for satellite imagery and some people who desperately want some information.
A station wagon in all of Texas.
It's incumbent upon those of us who are in the satellite imaging business to be able to explain to commanders and decision makers and people who aren't used to using them exactly what they can and can't do.
Hey, is that it?
Where? Oh, no, that's not it.
Because they often come in with unrealistic expectations based on movies and TV.
Point taken!
Delivering bad news, a bridge too far.
There.
Splendid view of the Dutch countryside. Can't see any tanks.
Wait a moment, sir. It's a lot clearer in the next picture.
The intelligence officer is showing his commander that there were tanks where they didn't think there would be any.
Yes. I shouldn't worry about them.
So, you see that they are tanks.
What I think is so important about this clip is the fact that the intelligence officer has to deliver things that he knows the commanders aren't going to want to hear.
You seriously consider asking us to cancel the biggest operation mounted since D-Day because of 3 photographs?
It's tough to tell commanders things that don't comport with their plan. As an intelligence officer, you're delivering things in an unbiased way with your best judgment, and sometimes it just isn't what the commander wants to hear.
This time the party's on.
Calculating collateral damage, eye in the sky.
If my target here can calculate is coming in under 50% for collateral damage on the girl, do you think you can get approval your end?
Yes, I do. Decisions around calculating collateral damage are dynamic and they're ongoing.
If we put the payload here or maybe here, well then we could guarantee the target fatality, but we could reduce the collateral.
Certainly as an intelligence professional, you want to understand that pattern of life. What normally happens around this house? What happens in the neighborhood around this house?
There is a 45 to 65% possibility of fatality.
65%?
Yes.
No. I need that calculation to be below 50%.
They're talking in super strict percentages here. There is an absolute art and science to weaponeering, to understanding the damage that a weapon's going to cause, the angle that it's going to come in, the amount of explosive in the weapon, and then using tools based on imagery, based on maps, and based on 3D models of the facility to understand precisely what the collateral damage is going to be.
Sergeant, we need to make this work.
There's clearly a subtext here, an undertone, that the analyst is being pressured to change his call to meet a criteria that was pre-decided.
There are many lives at risk.
These types of things can happen, and it comes down to moral courage. It comes down to being able to stand your ground rather than allow people to sort of nudge or change your judgment to fit a specific situation. Satellite hack, diamonds are forever.
Wait, something's happened.
In this scene, what happens is a nefarious actor, a bad guy, takes over a satellite.
Something's taken over the guidance system.
It's as if it had a will of its own.
We are completely incentivized to ensure that no one can get into the data stream, take over the satellite, or hack it in any way. That's critically important to us, and we work very hard to make sure that that simply can't happen. It looked like their budget was $100, is what it looked like.
There's not a damn thing we can do about it at the moment.
I mean, as hokey as some of the things in this scene might be, the depiction of the satellite deployment itself isn't really completely out of bounds. Perhaps the solar panels might not deploy until after separation from the second stage, if that's what it was. But otherwise, I mean, it's sort of close.
Well, that's a neat trick.
Private satellites die another day.
Imagine being able to grow crops the year round, bringing an end to hunger. Imagine a second sun, shining like a diamond in the sky.
In this scene, we see the bad guy here trying to replicate the sun, which seems like a pretty bad idea.
Let there be light.
So the first thing that strikes me in this scene is that is one massive space structure. It took years to launch and assemble the International Space Station. This is something that kind of looks like it's on that scale.
You have no idea how much Icarus is about to change your world.
Not everyone is a responsible actor in space. Some governments are irresponsible and some corporations are irresponsible. So on one hand, space is big, right? Big space, little satellite. But if there is no traffic cop, if there is no space traffic management, if there isn't a shared idea of what we call space domain awareness or space situational awareness, there's really an opportunity, a potential for a lot of bad stuff to happen on orbit. Knocked out of orbit, Austin Powers, gold member.
Sir, Dr. Evil's not bluffing. One of our satellites is falling out of orbit.
When it comes to this scene, just sticking to the satellite stuff, what's interesting here is space is a war-fighting domain, and thus the recent creation of the United States Space Force. Several countries on Earth have demonstrated an ability to do ASAT, anti-satellite operations. In fact, the United States did it first by firing a missile from a U.S. Air Force aircraft in 1985. You know, one thing we see a lot of is satellites zooming through space. They all look different, they've all got different things bolted on in different configurations. But in fact, in low Earth orbit, they are kind of zooming. They're going about 18,000 miles an hour, 300 miles up. So they're kind of moving. Satellite sabotage, Space Force.
Epsilon should be passing right about now.
Oh, yeah, there's a spark.
Beautiful. Wow.
So it struck me immediately in this clip as General Naird is talking to his science advisor is that he apparently has the world's best telescope right outside his house.
I got it.
He's able to see in incredible detail what's happening on orbit.
Wait, is that a second spark?
While this looks like some silly depiction of something happening on orbit, it's actually not completely out of the realm of the possible. Space Command Commander General Dickinson recently acknowledged that the Chinese have the capability potentially to quote-unquote grapple another satellite with an arm.
Motherfucker!
Close-up surveillance, Homeland.
Who's he? Do we recognize him?
I think he's just a kid from the village.
Well, he's definitely spotted us.
So the type of UAV, drone, or remotely piloted aircraft that's depicted here is a Predator B. A Predator B can operate as high as 50,000 feet. It's not particularly loud, and in fact, you'd normally want to operate it in a way that your adversary wouldn't know that they were under surveillance. As I watched this and the idea of, is this realistic? I suppose if there was some reason operationally that they brought the aircraft down a little lower or brought it in a little closer than they might normally do, it's possible that the young man could have heard it or seen it and looked up in the sky. This reminds me of a scene from Men in Black when Agent K is sort of having a moment, keeping an eye on his wife with some sort of surveillance activity. The scene from Men in Black looks more like it's something from a CCTV camera that might be on some sort of really tall pole versus the much more realistic depiction we saw in Homeland.
We're bulletproof on this.
Outsmarting surveillance, body of lies. In this scene, the bad guys are understanding that they might be under surveillance.
Which one do you want us to follow?
I think what's important here to understand is something we talk about in the intelligence community is protecting sources and methods. We don't want people to understand what we can do, when we can do it, and how we can do it, because that gives them an edge. That gives them the ability to think about how they might be able to defeat that advantage.
Real intelligence operations, they remain secret forever.
Conclusion.
I think the most important thing I'd want to leave the audience with is to take a look with a skeptical eye. Think about what's actually possible. Think about what looks like it makes sense, because there's such a mix here of things that are absolutely plausible and things that are absolutely never going to happen, and they're completely unrealistic. Thank you, Wired.